During a relentless snowstorm, a young girl stumbles upon a mysterious woman lying in the park, sparking a whirlwind of unexpected twists that will transform both their lives forever. You won't believe how lies, money, and the past intertwine to shape their fates in a tale of resilience and redemption. Alice knew life wouldn't be easy. At 16, she carried burdens that would make most adults falter. Living with her bitter, controlling aunt, her small suburban apartment felt more like a prison than a home. Every corner of the space seemed to whisper stories of fights, lies, and stifled dreams. Still, Alice clung to what little she had, her job at the diner and the faint hope that, one day, the world could be bigger than those four walls. The days at the diner weren't much better. Hours were spent cleaning tables, hearing customer complaints, and enduring condescending stares. Her paycheck barely covered expenses, but Alice knew she depended on it to keep a fragile balance in her life. Sometimes, as she flipped burgers or prepped fries, she allowed herself to daydream about a future where she wouldn't have to choose between surviving and truly living, a future that felt as distant as the stars. Life in the neighborhood was yet another battle. The streets were filled with dangerous twists and turns, where a history of violence and despair seemed to perpetuate itself like a curse. Alice kept her head down, trying to remain invisible. Drawing attention in a place like that was an invitation for trouble. The constant sound of sirens at night was a stark reminder that safety was an illusion for people like her, who couldn't afford a better life. Despite everything, there were moments when Alice allowed herself to dream. On her hardest days, she would look up at the sky and imagine what it would be like to escape that world. There was something inside her, a small but persistent flame, that refused to be extinguished. Even when her aunt told her she had no future or when her schoolmates mocked her circumstances, Alice held on to the idea that maybe, just maybe, she was meant for something more. Her aunt's past was a mystery that constantly piqued Alice's curiosity. There was something about her sharp words and refusal to talk about life before the suburbs that seemed to hide secrets. Secrets Alice wasn't sure she wanted to uncover but felt shaped the woman's bitterness. Sometimes, Alice wondered if her aunt was just as much a victim of circumstances as she was. Weeks went by, and Alice felt increasingly trapped. Money was tight, her dreams were too big, and the lies she told herself, that one day everything would be okay, were a temporary bomb. Winter was harsher than ever, and the apartment's small heater barely made a difference. At night, under a thin blanket, Alice felt the cold seep into her bones, a cruel reminder of how unforgiving the world outside could be. There was a voice inside her that sometimes whispered for her to give up, to accept that this was her destiny and that dreams were reserved for people with money and power, not for girls lost in the middle of a forgotten suburb. But Alice, stubborn as she was, ignored that voice. Perhaps because, deep down, she knew that giving up would mean allowing her aunts and her own past to define her forever. At work, Alice would observe the occasional wealthy customer who walked in. They seemed like beings from another world, with expensive clothes and conversations about vacations that felt unreachable. She wasn't envious, just curious. Who were these people and how did they get so far? Secretly, she wished that one day someone would look at her with admiration rather than pity. Despite the harshness of life, Alice had a knack for finding small moments of joy. A generous tip left by a customer, a child's smile at the counter, or a song on the diner's radio that briefly made her forget where she was. These moments were rare but precious, and somehow, they kept her going. Winter arrived in full force, and Alice felt like something was about to change. There was a weight in the air, something she couldn't explain but that seemed to promise a turning point. That night, as she locked up the diner and faced the storm outside, Alice had no idea she was about to cross paths with someone who would change her life forever. The storm felt endless. The cutting wind turned every step into a battle, and the snow piled up, making the path nearly impassable. Alice hugged her arms tightly around her body, struggling to keep what little warmth she had. Facing hardship on her way home was nothing new, but tonight, something felt different. The abandoned park she always avoided looked even darker under the dim glow of the streetlights. As she walked quickly, something caught her eye. A shape, almost indistinguishable beneath the white blanket of snow, was lying near one of the benches. Her heart raced. Her mind flooded with possibilities. An animal? Someone in trouble? Or something worse? She hesitated, stepping back. Her instincts told her to keep walking, but curiosity rooted her in place. As she moved closer, Alice realized it was a woman. Her face was partially covered in snow, her lips tinged blue from the cold. She appeared unconscious but alive. Alice felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She didn't know what to do. She looked around for help, but the park was deserted. The idea of simply leaving her there crossed Alice's mind, but her conscience wouldn't let her. The woman wasn't dressed for the weather. A thin jacket and torn shoes hinted that she wasn't prepared for a storm like this. Alice couldn't understand how someone could end up in such a state, in such a place. Despite the doubts and fears swirling in her mind, there was something about this moment that wouldn't let her walk away. Alice crouched beside the woman, gently touching her arm. "Hey, can you hear me?" Her voice sounded steadier than she felt. The woman murmured something inaudible, her lips barely moving. It was enough to tell Alice she still had a chance, but what could she do? She wasn't experienced with emergencies or strangers. The cold was becoming unbearable, and Alice could feel her fingers starting to go numb. Every minute spent there was dangerous, but the thought of leaving the woman alone was unthinkable. She considered calling the police or an ambulance, but who would respond quickly in a storm like this? And deep down, there was the fear. What if helping brought her trouble? Alice stood up, hesitating for a moment before making a decision. She looked down at the woman lying in the snow and muttered to herself, "I can't just leave her here." It was a simple choice but an incredibly difficult one. Because by doing this, she knew she was stepping into something that would change her night, and possibly her life. Gathering all her strength, Alice tried to lift the woman. The weight, combined with her exhaustion, made the effort feel impossible, but she refused to give up. Using every ounce of determination, she managed to get the woman on her feet, supporting her on her shoulder. The nearest destination she could think of was an improvised shelter in an abandoned building she knew. As she struggled through the snow to reach the shelter, Alice couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Perhaps it was paranoia brought on by fear and exhaustion, but the thought of someone appearing, whether to help or harm, kept her on edge. Strangely, the woman leaning against her seemed to bring an unexpected sense of calm. Reaching the building was a relief. It wasn't the safest place, but at least it offered protection from the biting wind. Alice lowered the woman carefully to the floor, pulling out her phone to try contacting someone who could help. As she waited for a response, she noticed something unsettling in the woman's expression. It was as if the stranger was more than she appeared to be, but Alice didn't yet know just how right her instincts were. Inside the abandoned building, the sound of the wind howled louder than ever, echoing off the empty walls. Alice stared at the unconscious woman, trying to silence the storm of thoughts in her head. What was she doing here? None of this made sense. Taking this kind of risk for a complete stranger wasn't like her. Doubt gnawed at her, and the idea of walking away felt more tempting with each passing second. Her phone, trembling in her numb hand, had no signal strong enough to make a call. Frustration bubbled up inside her. "Why me?" she whispered to no one in particular, as though the universe might answer. She knew no one would come to save them anytime soon, and the responsibility of helping this woman felt like a weight far too heavy for her to bear. The woman shifted slightly, releasing a faint groan that made Alice shiver. It was barely audible, but it was filled with pain. Alice turned her gaze away, a pang of guilt twisting in her chest. She didn't want to be here, didn't want to be the hero of a story she hadn't asked to be part of. All she wanted was to get home, hide under her blanket, and pretend this night had never happened. The woman's clothes told a troubling story. Her thin jacket and worn shoes suggested desperation, maybe homelessness. Alice had heard too many warnings about situations like this. What if this woman was dangerous? What if this was some kind of trap? The neighborhood was full of stories about people being taken advantage of when they let their guard down. The thought made her stomach churn. Alice stood, taking a few steps toward the exit of the building. "This isn't my problem," she muttered, trying to convince herself. But no matter how much she wanted to leave, something anchored her in place. Maybe it was the woman's fragile, vulnerable state, or maybe it was that small, annoying voice in her head, the one that refused to let her ignore someone in need. She's just another person, Alice thought, trying to rationalize her fear. And I'm just a girl who can't even fix her own life. That thought hit her harder than she expected. Who was she to help anyone? Alice felt like if she tried to do more than she already had, she'd fail, just like she had so many times before. Walking out the door and pretending she'd never seen anything felt like the easier, safer choice. The freezing wind that blew in through the broken windows made her hug herself tighter. The woman's condition was visibly worsening, and every minute wasted seemed like a death sentence. Alice bit her lip, frustration and fear battling inside her. She hated how much she cared. She didn't want to be this person, the one who put someone else's needs ahead of her own. It wasn't fair, it wasn't safe, and it was probably a decision she'd regret. But even as she tried to take the first step toward leaving, her feet wouldn't move. It was as though something invisible held her there, a force she couldn't explain. A lump formed in her throat. Deep down, she knew that leaving would mean carrying an even heavier burden, the guilt of not doing anything when she could have. Maybe this is a bad idea, she whispered to herself, tasting the bitterness of doubt. But what if it's the right thing to do? The words lingered in the air, echoing inside her. For the first time, Alice allowed herself to imagine that there might be something bigger behind this encounter. Something she couldn't see yet, but that called to her in a way she couldn't ignore. With a heavy sigh, Alice knelt back down beside the woman. She didn't know what her next steps would be or how she'd handle this situation, but something had shifted. A small decision had been made, even if her mind still resisted it. There was a journey ahead, and though fear still loomed large, Alice realized she had already taken the first hesitant step. The sound of an approaching ambulance finally broke through the suffocating silence of the abandoned building. Alice felt a wave of relief mixed with anxiety as paramedics carefully loaded the woman onto a makeshift stretcher. They asked Alice a series of quick questions, but she could barely respond. Exhausted, soaked from the snowstorm, and overwhelmed, she felt smaller than ever in the midst of the chaos she had initiated. At the hospital, the emergency room was a whirlwind of voices and bright lights. Alice lingered in a corner, trembling from both the cold and her nerves. Part of her wanted to leave, to forget the entire night, but something held her there. She didn't understand why, but she felt an obligation to stay, as if knowing how the woman was doing was more important than her own safety. Hours passed before a doctor approached her, informing her that the woman was stable but required care. Alice exhaled deeply, a mixture of relief and tension washing over her. When the doctor asked her name and her relationship to the patient, she hesitated. "I just found her," she said quietly, almost embarrassed. The doctor seemed surprised but didn't press further. Alice finally had the chance to see the woman. Margaret, that was the name the staff was now using, was awake, though still visibly weak. When their eyes met, something unexpected happened. "Thank you," Margaret whispered, her voice hoarse but sincere. Alice didn't know how to respond. Nobody ever thanked her for anything, least of all a stranger. There was something in Margaret's eyes that was hard to ignore, a glint of intensity, of understanding that seemed to pierce right through Alice. It made her uncomfortable and curious all at once. Margaret tried to say more, but her voice failed her. Even so, Alice could sense that the words left unsaid carried a weight she couldn't yet understand. As the days went by, Alice began visiting Margaret regularly, though she wasn't sure why. Their conversations were brief but felt significant. Margaret, despite her vulnerability, had a presence that was almost magnetic. She asked Alice questions that no one else had ever asked, ones that made her feel both seen and exposed. It was as if Margaret could sense the invisible scars Alice carried. During one of these visits, Margaret revealed that she was an author. Alice's eyes widened in surprise. She had never met someone who wrote books, who created entire worlds with words. "You have something special," Margaret said, looking directly at Alice. The younger girl laughed it off, finding the comment ridiculous. Yet, deep inside, those words planted a seed she couldn't ignore. Margaret began sharing snippets of her life. She spoke about losing her family, about the twists and turns that led her to isolation. Alice listened in silence, feeling a strange connection she couldn't explain. Their stories were vastly different, yet there was a shared undercurrent of pain and resilience. It was as though they were both searching for the same thing, a reason to keep going. No matter how hard she tried, Alice couldn't ignore the impact Margaret was having on her life. The older woman was unlike anyone she had ever met, someone who looked past appearances and saw potential where no one else did. This was new, almost frightening, but also deeply comforting. For the first time, Alice began to wonder if there might be more to her future than the monotonous grind she had resigned herself to. That evening, as she walked home through the cold, Alice couldn't stop thinking about Margaret's words. "You have something special." Why would she say that? And what could she possibly see that no one else had noticed? The wind bit at her face, but for the first time in a long while, Alice felt a warmth growing inside her, a hint that perhaps a new chapter was about to begin. Alice hesitated before heading back to the hospital the next day, but something kept pushing her forward. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the look in Margaret's eyes, one that seemed to see a version of Alice she couldn't yet recognize. As she stepped through the revolving doors, she felt a mix of nervousness and determination. She didn't know why, but she felt Margaret was important. She just couldn't explain how or why, not yet. Margaret was more alert that morning, and her faint smile was the first thing Alice noticed when she entered the room. "You came back," Margaret said, her voice soft but filled with satisfaction. Alice felt a twinge of embarrassment as she mumbled a response. She wasn't used to being noticed or wanted, and hearing those words unsettled her in a way she couldn't quite articulate. Their conversation flowed more naturally this time. Margaret shared stories from her youth, about the books she'd written, and the unexpected turns her life had taken. Alice listened, captivated. There was something comforting about Margaret's voice. Every word felt steeped in both wisdom and pain. Margaret didn't seem to be trying to impress her. She was simply sharing, and that honesty made all the difference. Alice began to realize that helping Margaret wasn't just about the woman she had found in the snow. It was about confronting her own fears. Each time she stepped into that hospital, she was pushing against the boundaries she had built around herself. It wasn't just Margaret who needed help. Alice was beginning to understand that she, too, needed something, though she wasn't sure what. Visiting Margaret became part of Alice's routine, though she kept it a secret. She didn't mention it at the diner, and she certainly didn't tell her aunt. It was as if this new piece of her life was something sacred, something she needed to protect from the cynicism of the outside world. Margaret, meanwhile, seemed to grow stronger with each passing day, and the bond between them deepened. Margaret started asking small favors, retrieving books from the library or bringing tea from the hospital cafe. It wasn't about the tasks themselves, Alice realized, but what they represented. Margaret was gently pushing her to step out of her comfort zone. At first, Alice resisted, feeling unsure, but each favor completed left her with a small but undeniable sense of accomplishment. One evening, Margaret shared a deeply personal story about a book she had been working on before her life fell apart. Then, she turned to Alice with an unexpected question. "Have you ever thought about what you really want in life?" The question startled Alice. Wanting something felt like a luxury, and luxuries weren't meant for girls like her. She shook her head, but the thought lingered. As she walked home that night, the question kept replaying in her mind. What did she want? Freedom? Security? A place to belong? The possibilities felt both overwhelming and exhilarating. For the first time, Alice allowed herself to consider that wanting something wasn't selfish, it was human. And maybe, just maybe, she was allowed to dream after all. When she returned to the hospital the next day, Margaret greeted her with a knowing smile. It was as if she could see the change in Alice before she even spoke. Alice didn't fully understand what was happening, but she was beginning to trust the process. Margaret wasn't just helping her see a different future, she was showing her that it could be within reach. As the evening came to a close, Margaret gently held Alice's hand. "Don't let fear decide for you," she said, her voice both gentle and firm. Alice didn't reply, but those words stayed with her long after she left. She didn't know what lay ahead, but for the first time, she felt ready to take the next step, even if she didn't know where it would lead. The hospital seemed colder and more unwelcoming that morning. Alice noticed the lingering stares from the staff and the occasional whispers behind her back. Her regular visits to Margaret hadn't gone unnoticed, and not everyone was supportive. Some nurses and doctors seemed to view her with suspicion, judging her shabby clothes and tired demeanor. Alice pretended not to care, but each side glance and hushed comment cut deeper than she let on. Margaret noticed the tension. Subtly, she began defending Alice to anyone who would listen. "This young woman has more courage than most of us," Margaret would say firmly whenever a nurse or doctor entered the room. But Alice knew that for many, she was just a poor girl trying to attach herself to someone with money. The judgment stung, even if she told herself it didn't matter. The situation grew more complicated when Margaret's relatives began showing up. Well-dressed and with polished manners, they carried an air of concern, but their intentions were painfully obvious to Alice. They wanted Margaret's money. The atmosphere in the room grew tense whenever they arrived, and Margaret greeted them with a mix of exhaustion and disdain. Alice kept quiet during these visits, trying to stay invisible. She would sit in a corner, her presence ignored but clearly felt. One of the relatives finally asked, "Who's this?" Their voice was sharp, their tone icy. Alice felt her stomach churn. Before she could speak, Margaret answered, "This is Alice. She's my friend." The simplicity of her words startled everyone, especially Alice. Margaret's relatives didn't hide their skepticism. Their cold, judging gazes shifted toward Alice, as though trying to find cracks in her existence. Alice felt her cheeks burn, torn between humiliation and pride that Margaret had defended her. But she knew these people weren't the type to back down. They were enemies disguised as family, and they wouldn't leave without a fight. One afternoon, as Alice sat reading to Margaret, one of the relatives barged in unannounced. "You need to think about what's best for everyone, Margaret," they said in a tone dripping with fake concern. Alice clenched the book in her hands, her knuckles turning white. She wanted to speak up, to tell them off, but her voice felt caught in her throat. Later that evening, Margaret reassured her. "Don't let them make you doubt who you are," she said with her characteristic firmness. Alice nodded, but the relatives' words still echoed in her mind. They were the kind of people who always seemed to win, and Alice couldn't help but wonder if Margaret's faith in her was misplaced. Amid the tension, Alice found unexpected allies. A kind nurse named Clara often offered her encouraging smiles and comforting words. "You're doing something amazing," Clara said one day. "Don't let anyone make you think otherwise." Those small moments of kindness were like tiny lights in the darkness, and they gave Alice the strength to keep going. The challenges only grew. One morning, Alice arrived at the hospital to find Margaret looking more defeated than she'd ever seen her. "They want to put me in a nursing home," Margaret said, her voice heavy with sadness. Alice felt the ground shift beneath her. How could they even suggest something like that? Margaret was strong, capable, and deserving of her independence. As the days passed, Alice realized that the odds were stacked against them. The relatives, the system, the whispered judgments, they were all obstacles in a battle that felt impossible to win. But for the first time, Alice wasn't thinking about running away. Margaret had given her something invaluable, the courage to fight, not just for someone else, but for herself as well. With each passing day, the bond between Alice and Margaret grew stronger. Margaret's quiet strength became a source of inspiration for Alice, while Alice's fierce determination gave Margaret hope. Together, they were navigating a battlefield they hadn't chosen, but neither of them was willing to give up. And though the challenges loomed large, so did the possibility of victory. Margaret's hospital room felt unusually heavy that morning. Something unspoken lingered in the air as Alice stepped in and found Margaret holding a trembling letter. "They're suing me," Margaret said bluntly, her voice uncharacteristically frail. Alice froze, the words sinking in like stones. For the first time, the weight of the situation Margaret faced became terrifyingly real. Margaret's relatives were trying to have her declared legally incompetent, a calculated move to seize control of her finances. It was cruel, but Alice wasn't surprised. She had felt their venom in every interaction. Now, their intentions were laid bare, and the fight Margaret had been avoiding was finally at her doorstep. But Margaret wasn't one to give up easily. Despite her fragile health, she began devising a plan to fight back. "They think I'm weak because I have money," she said bitterly, a spark of determination flashing in her eyes. But they don't know who they're dealing with? Watching Margaret's resolve ignited something in Alice, though she didn't yet know how to help. Alice threw herself into action. She spent her nights poring over articles about legal processes and searching for lawyers who might represent Margaret. She didn't know the first thing about lawsuits, but she refused to stand idly by. Margaret had already done so much for her, and Alice felt compelled to repay her in whatever way she could. One day, Margaret made a proposition that caught Alice completely off guard. "I want you to live with me," she said, her voice calm but firm. Alice blinked in disbelief. "You can't be serious," she replied, laughing nervously. But Margaret wasn't joking. She saw in Alice something others overlooked: potential, strength, and the desire for a better life. "You deserve more than what you've been given," Margaret insisted. The idea was both thrilling and terrifying. Alice couldn't imagine leaving behind her familiar, albeit painful, routine to live with someone like Margaret. And then there was the question of how Margaret's relatives would twist the situation. "They'll say I'm manipulating you," Alice muttered, more to herself than to Margaret. Margaret's response was simple and unwavering. "Let them talk," she said. "What matters is what you want." That statement stayed with Alice for days. What did she want? It was a simple question, but it opened a chasm inside her. For the first time, she began to imagine that maybe, just maybe, she could want something for herself. As the legal battle drew closer, the pressure on both Margaret and Alice intensified. Alice became a constant presence by Margaret's side, even as judgmental stares and harsh whispers tried to undermine her resolve. The young woman didn't know how the fight would end, but she was learning to stand tall, even when fear threatened to topple her. Margaret's lawyer suggested that Alice might need to testify if the case went to trial. The idea made Alice's stomach churn. "Me? I'm nobody," she said, her voice shaking with doubt. Margaret reached out, placing a steady hand on hers. "You're somebody, Alice. You just need to believe it." Those words hit deeper than Alice expected, giving her the tiniest glimmer of courage. On the way home that night, Alice found herself reflecting on how far she had come. The thought of leaving her old life behind and starting something new was daunting, but it was also exhilarating. Margaret's belief in her was unshakable, and slowly, Alice began to think that maybe she was worth believing in too. Margaret, with her ever-present calm, reminded Alice that the fight ahead wasn't just about money or legalities, it was about dignity and choice. Together, they were stepping into a storm, but this time, neither of them would be facing it alone. The courtroom was cold and uninviting, a sterile space where lives were reduced to documents and arguments. Alice sat next to Margaret, feeling the weight of every gaze in the room. Across from them were Margaret's relatives, their polished appearances masking their true intentions. Alice could sense their confidence, a smug assurance that the system would side with them. Her chest tightened as the proceedings began. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. Margaret, despite her health and the stress of the situation, sat with a quiet dignity that Alice couldn't help but admire. The lawyer representing Margaret opened with a firm statement, painting a picture of her independence and the meaningful bond she had formed with Alice. On the other side, the relative's lawyer wasted no time in portraying Margaret as fragile and incapable, framing their interference as concern. When the lawyer asked Alice to testify, her heart pounded so loudly she thought everyone could hear it. She rose from her seat, hands trembling as she walked to the stand. Her fingers gripped the edge of the podium as she took a shaky breath. She had prepared notes but decided at the last second to speak from the heart. "I'm not here because I want something from Margaret," she began, her voice faltering but gaining strength. "I'm here because she's given me something I didn't think I deserved. A chance?" The relative's lawyer interrupted, trying to dismiss Alice's words as irrelevant. But the judge motioned for her to continue. Alice spoke about the night she found Margaret in the snow, about how their bond grew, and how Margaret believed in her when no one else did. "She's not fragile," Alice said, her voice steady now. "She's the strongest person I've ever met." Margaret's turn to testify came next, and she faced the courtroom with the same grace she always carried. "This young woman didn't ask for my help," Margaret said, "but she changed my life in ways I didn't think were possible. She's not here to take advantage of me. She's here because she cares. The raw honesty in her words silenced even her most skeptical relatives. The courtroom atmosphere shifted. The relatives, once so confident, now seemed uncertain. Margaret's lawyer highlighted her history as a capable and determined individual, someone who had faced immense loss and still carried herself with strength. Alice watched as the case turned in their favor, but she knew it wasn't over yet. The judge announced he needed time to deliberate, leaving everyone in the room suspended in uncertainty. Alice and Margaret walked out together, their hands brushing briefly as they exited. "You were incredible," Margaret said, her voice filled with pride. Alice smiled, though her nerves still hadn't settled. The future was out of their hands now, and all they could do was wait. During the days leading up to the decision, Alice reflected on what the fight truly meant. It wasn't just about legalities, it was about standing up for someone who had given her hope. Margaret, too, felt the weight of the case but leaned on Alice's determination to keep going. Together, they were navigating an uphill battle, one that had brought them closer than ever. When the verdict was finally announced, the courtroom was silent. The judge adjusted his glasses and read the decision slowly, deliberately. The court finds that Margaret is fully capable of managing her own affairs. Furthermore, her relationship with Alice is deemed genuine and mutually beneficial. Relief washed over both of them, tears welling in their eyes as they realized what this meant. The relatives left in defeat, their once confident demeanor now replaced with silence. Alice watched them go, not with malice, but with the quiet satisfaction of knowing they hadn't succeeded. Margaret squeezed her hand tightly as they exited the courtroom together, stepping into the sunlight with a newfound sense of freedom. Alice knew the fight wasn't just for Margaret, it had been for herself too. They had faced judgment, doubt, and fear, and yet they had come out stronger. For the first time, Alice felt like she was more than her past. She was part of something bigger, something meaningful, and that made all the difference. The judge's voice echoed in Alice's mind as they stepped out of the courtroom. The court finds that Margaret is fully capable of managing her own affairs. Those words felt surreal, like a victory she hadn't dared to believe in. Margaret squeezed Alice's hand, her eyes glistening with tears. They had done it. Against all odds, they had won. Margaret turned to Alice as they stood outside the courthouse. "I couldn't have done this without you," she said softly. Alice shook her head, overwhelmed. "You're the strong one," she replied, but Margaret smiled knowingly. "Strength comes in many forms, Alice. You're just starting to discover yours." The victory wasn't just a legal one, it marked the beginning of a new chapter. Margaret formally invited Alice to live with her, fulfilling the promise she had made. Alice hesitated at first, the thought of leaving behind everything she knew, no matter how painful, filling her with uncertainty. But something about Margaret's quiet confidence made her believe it was the right decision. Moving into Margaret's home was like stepping into another world. The cozy house was lined with bookshelves overflowing with stories, sunlight streaming through the large windows. It was a stark contrast to the cold, chaotic apartment Alice had shared with her aunt. For the first time, she felt what a home could truly be: warm, safe, and full of possibilities. The transition wasn't easy. Alice had to adjust to a new routine, a new environment, and, most importantly, a new sense of belonging. Margaret encouraged her to explore her passions, subtly pushing her to think beyond survival. "What do you want to do, Alice?" she asked one evening over tea. Alice didn't have an answer, but the question lingered in her mind, opening doors she had never dared to peek through before. Margaret began sharing more of her world with Alice. She introduced her to literature, not just as a reader but as a potential writer. At first, Alice balked at the idea, thinking it was too far-fetched. But Margaret's encouragement was unwavering. "You have a voice, Alice. The world needs to hear it," she said, placing a blank notebook in her hands. That notebook became a quiet invitation for Alice to dream. Alice's first attempts at writing were hesitant and clumsy, but Margaret celebrated every word. "You're finding your way," she reassured her, each piece of feedback filled with care. Slowly, Alice began to see writing as more than just an activity. It was a way to process her pain, explore her dreams, and imagine a future she had never believed was possible. Their bond deepened as they celebrated small victories together. Alice's first completed story, Margaret's renewed passion for her own writing, and even mundane moments like sharing a quiet meal were now filled with meaning. The house, once a solitary space for Margaret, came alive with Alice's energy and curiosity. For Alice, the greatest reward wasn't material. It was the sense of worth she was beginning to feel. Margaret's belief in her wasn't just inspiring, it was transformative. "I see you," Margaret had said once, and Alice realized how rare it was for someone to truly look past the surface. That simple acknowledgement became a cornerstone of their relationship. Margaret, too, found a renewed purpose. Helping Alice gave her a sense of fulfillment that she hadn't felt in years. In guiding Alice, she rediscovered parts of herself she thought had been lost: her resilience, her hope, and her love for storytelling. Together, they were building something neither of them had ever known: a family, unconventional but deeply real. As the days turned into weeks, Alice and Margaret settled into a rhythm that felt like home. The past still lingered in quiet moments, but it no longer defined them. They were forging a future together, one filled with mutual respect, trust, and the promise of new beginnings. For the first time, both of them felt free. Life in Margaret's home settled into a steady rhythm, though it was anything but ordinary for Alice. Each morning began with the smell of freshly brewed coffee and sunlight streaming through the windows. Margaret, often with a book in hand, encouraged Alice to start the day by writing or reading something inspiring. At first, Alice felt out of place in such a calm and welcoming space, but slowly, it began to feel like a home she'd always longed for. Returning to her studies was the first major step Alice took toward rebuilding her life. With Margaret's encouragement, she enrolled in evening classes to complete her education. Sitting in a classroom again was daunting at first. Surrounded by peers who were also seeking second chances, Alice realized she wasn't alone. Every assignment completed and every kind word from a teacher was a small victory, proof that she was capable of more than she had ever believed. At home, Margaret introduced Alice to the world of literature in a way that felt transformative. Together, they organized shelves filled with Margaret's books, each one a gateway to new ideas and possibilities. "These aren't just stories," Margaret told her. "They're lessons, escapes, and sometimes maps to find ourselves." Alice began exploring genres she had never considered, finding a deep connection with the characters and themes. One afternoon, while dusting a particularly crowded shelf, Margaret handed Alice a leather-bound notebook. "For your stories," she said with a smile. Alice hesitated, the weight of the notebook in her hands feeling both daunting and thrilling. She had never seen herself as a writer, but Margaret's confidence in her was contagious. That notebook became a sanctuary where Alice could pour out her thoughts, hopes, and even the lingering pain of her past. As Alice began writing, she discovered that the process was both challenging and healing. The words didn't always come easily, but when they did, it was like uncovering pieces of herself she hadn't known were missing. Margaret became her first and most devoted reader, always offering feedback that was equal parts constructive and encouraging. "You have a gift," Margaret would say, and slowly, Alice started to believe her. Meanwhile, Margaret found her own renewal through Alice's growth. Watching the young woman flourish reminded her of why she had started writing in the first place: to capture the raw, unfiltered beauty of human resilience. Margaret began working on a new book, inspired by her connection with Alice. Her once dormant creativity now flowed freely, fueled by their shared journey. The connection between them deepened as they faced life's challenges together. Alice, who had once felt like an outsider everywhere she went, began to feel truly seen for the first time. Margaret, who had lived in solitude for so long, found joy in guiding and supporting someone who needed her just as much as she needed them. Their bond became a foundation, something neither of them had ever had before. Alice's confidence grew with each passing day. She submitted a short story to a local writing contest on Margaret's insistence. Though she doubted herself, Margaret's encouragement pushed her to take the leap. Weeks later, when Alice received an email announcing she had won, she couldn't believe it. Margaret celebrated as though it were her own victory, reminding Alice of how far she had come. As the seasons changed, so did Alice and Margaret. Together, they rebuilt not just their own lives, but a shared sense of belonging. Their home became a space where dreams, big and small, were nurtured. For Alice, the journey wasn't just about finding a better life. It was about discovering who she was and realizing she had the power to create the future she wanted. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Margaret turned to Alice and said, "You've come so far." Alice smiled, feeling the truth of those words. For the first time, the road ahead didn't seem so daunting. With Margaret by her side, Alice knew she could face whatever came next. Spring arrived quietly, with soft breezes and blooming flowers that seemed to mirror the changes in Alice and Margaret's lives. The warmth of the season brought a sense of renewal, but with it came shadows from the past that neither could ignore. Alice, despite her growth, still felt the weight of old insecurities pulling at her in quiet moments. And Margaret, though outwardly strong, carried her own unspoken burdens. It started with a letter. Alice received it unexpectedly one morning, her name scrawled in her aunt's familiar, harsh handwriting. As she opened it, her heart sank. The message was cold and accusatory, demanding she return to resolve her obligations. Alice felt a storm of emotions, fear, anger, and a flicker of guilt she didn't want to acknowledge. The past had a way of finding her, no matter how far she tried to run. Margaret noticed Alice's unease immediately. "What's wrong?" she asked gently. Alice hesitated before showing her the letter. Margaret's expression darkened, but her voice remained calm. "You don't owe her anything," she said. "But if you feel like you need to confront this, I'll support you." Alice nodded, unsure of what she wanted but knowing she couldn't avoid this forever. The decision to visit her aunt wasn't easy. Alice insisted on going alone, feeling it was something she needed to face by herself. "I'll be here when you get back," Margaret assured her, her words a lifeline. As Alice made the journey back to the small, cramped apartment she had once called home, memories of her old life flooded her mind. The fear of being dragged back into that world made her stomach churn. When Alice arrived, nothing had changed. The apartment was still chaotic, filled with the same oppressive energy she had escaped. Her aunt greeted her with a barrage of accusations, claiming Alice was ungrateful and selfish for leaving. But this time, something was different. Alice didn't crumble under the weight of her aunt's words. Instead, she stood her ground. "I'm grateful for what you've done," Alice said, her voice steady. "But that doesn't give you the right to control me or make me feel small. I deserve better, and I'm not coming back." Her aunt stared at her, stunned into silence. For the first time, Alice felt a sense of power, not over someone else, but over herself. She had taken back a piece of her identity that had been stolen long ago. When Alice returned to Margaret's home, she was greeted with a warm hug and the quiet reassurance that everything was going to be okay. Margaret didn't ask for details, understanding instinctively that Alice needed space to process what had happened. That evening, as they sat together, Margaret simply said, "I'm proud of you." Those words carried more weight than Alice could have imagined. The experience awakened something in Alice. Confronting her past had been terrifying, but it also brought a sense of liberation. She began pouring her emotions into her writing, using the pages of her notebook as a way to process everything she had endured. Margaret, as always, was her first reader, offering thoughtful feedback and unwavering encouragement. Margaret, too, found herself facing her own ghosts. Inspired by Alice's bravery, she began revisiting memories she had long buried. The book she was writing became more personal, exploring themes of loss and resilience. For both women, the act of creating became a form of healing, a way to transform their pain into something meaningful. Together, they faced their shadows head-on. Late-night conversations about their fears and dreams became a ritual, strengthening their bond. Margaret helped Alice see that her past didn't define her, while Alice reminded Margaret that it was never too late to start over. Their relationship, once built on necessity, had become a partnership of mutual growth. One night, as they sat by the fire, Margaret said something that stayed with Alice. "You don't just survive what you've been through, you rise from it." Alice nodded, feeling the truth of those words in her bones. They were no longer defined by their pasts. They had resurrected themselves, not as victims, but as women who had chosen to fight for the lives they deserved. The days that followed their shared triumphs were marked by a profound sense of calm and fulfillment. Margaret's home, once a quiet and solitary space, now thrived with energy and creativity. Books, notebooks, and handwritten pages filled the surfaces, as both women found joy in the routines they had built together. The house, warmed by the spring sun, had become more than just a shelter, it was a haven. Alice, who had once felt invisible in a world that seemed to reject her, was now stepping into a new chapter of her life with confidence. Her writing had started to attract attention, and her latest short story had been published in a local anthology. The book sat proudly on the shelf in Margaret's living room, a testament to how far Alice had come. Margaret often teased her, saying, "It's only the first of many." Margaret, too, was flourishing. Her book, inspired by her journey with Alice, was nearing completion. The process of writing had rekindled something inside her, a sense of purpose she thought she had lost. She often shared passages with Alice, who offered insightful feedback and unfiltered praise. "You're not just a mentor," Alice had told her once. "You're a storyteller. And your story matters." The bond between them deepened with every shared victory, big or small. Alice celebrated Margaret's writing milestones with as much enthusiasm as her own, and Margaret cheered Alice on as she navigated the world of education and creativity. Together, they created a rhythm that was both comforting and inspiring, each drawing strength from the other. One afternoon, as they sat in the garden, Margaret turned to Alice and said, "You've built something extraordinary here." Alice, startled, looked at her mentor. "Me? You gave me this chance?" Margaret shook her head. "I opened a door. You walked through it?" The words resonated deeply with Alice, who was finally starting to see her own power. The past no longer loomed over them as it once had. Instead, it served as a reminder of their resilience and the choices that had brought them together. The struggles they had faced, both separately and together, had forged a connection that felt more like family than either of them had ever known. The home they shared was not just a physical space. It was a foundation for the lives they were building. Alice began to dream bigger. Margaret encouraged her to apply to a creative writing program at a nearby college, a step Alice would have deemed impossible just a year ago. "What's the worst that could happen?" Margaret asked with a grin. "Rejection isn't failure. Not trying is." With Margaret's unwavering support, Alice submitted her application, feeling nervous but hopeful. When the acceptance letter arrived weeks later, Alice was stunned. She reread it several times, her hands trembling. Margaret hugged her tightly, tears of pride welling in her eyes. "I told you," she whispered. That moment cemented something for Alice. A belief in her own potential, a realization that she was capable of so much more than she had ever allowed herself to imagine. As the sun set on another peaceful day, Alice and Margaret sat on the porch, gazing at the horizon. Margaret raised her glass of wine and said, "To second chances." Alice, holding her glass of juice, smiled. "And to new beginnings." The clink of their glasses echoed softly, a small but powerful gesture that spoke of their journey together. They both knew the road ahead would still have challenges, but they also knew they were equipped to face them. The strength they had found in each other had become a wellspring of hope and purpose. Their story wasn't just about surviving, it was about thriving, about creating a life filled with meaning, connection, and the courage to keep moving forward. As the stars emerged above them, Alice looked at Margaret and said, "I used to think people like me didn't get to have happy endings." Margaret smiled, her eyes shining with warmth. "Maybe it's not about endings," she replied. "Maybe it's about what we create along the way." In that moment, they both understood that their greatest triumph wasn't just what they had overcome, but the bond they had built, a bond that would carry them into whatever came next. Months had passed since the courtroom victory that had cemented the bond between Alice and Margaret. Margaret's house, once a quiet and solitary space, now buzzed with life and creativity. Stacks of books, manuscripts, and journals filled every corner, reflecting the new routines they had built together. The sunlight streaming through the windows seemed to echo the warmth they had found in their shared life. Alice had grown into a version of herself she never thought possible. Her writing had begun to attract attention, with her short stories appearing in local magazines and anthologies. The first publication of her work sat proudly on the living room shelf, a physical reminder of how far she had come. Margaret often teased her, saying, "This is only the beginning." Margaret herself had experienced a renewal she hadn't expected. The book she had worked on so painstakingly was finally complete, a story deeply inspired by her connection with Alice. It was a tale of resilience and hope, one she felt compelled to share with the world. "You remind me why I started writing," she told Alice one evening. Those words carried a weight that Alice would never forget. Their bond became the foundation of a life filled with small but meaningful celebrations. Margaret cheered Alice on as she explored her growing passion for writing, while Alice provided Margaret with fresh perspectives and encouragement in her work. Together, they created a home that was vibrant with shared dreams and mutual respect. One day, as they sorted through books in the attic, Alice found an old photograph of Margaret with her late family. She studied the image quietly before asking, "Do you miss them?" Margaret sighed, taking the photo in her hands. "Always," she said softly. "But in some ways, I found a new family. One I never thought I'd have." Alice felt a warmth bloom in her chest at those words. That evening, they celebrated their journey with a simple dinner in the garden. Margaret raised her glass, a playful twinkle in her eye. "To unexpected twists," she said, grinning at Alice. "And to the past," Alice added, holding up her own glass, "which brought us here, and to the future, which we've yet to write." As the house glowed softly behind them and the stars began to fill the sky, both women felt a profound sense of peace. Their journey had been marked by pain and challenges, but it had also been filled with resilience, connection, and transformation. Together, they had created not just a home, but a life built on trust and shared hope. Alice looked up at the stars, feeling lighter than she ever had before. For so long, she had believed that people like her didn't get happy endings. But now she understood something deeper. It wasn't about endings at all. It was about the choices and connections made along the way. With Margaret by her side, Alice knew that their story was far from over. The future stretched out before them, wide and full of possibility.